Today we're going to be talking about issues that led up to the United States Civil War, which lasted from 1861 to 1865. The causes of the Civil War are pretty complex, and it's important that you start off with knowing the main differences between the northern states and the southern states. On the left side of your screen, you'll see a web that breaks down main issues that you can compare the North and the South on: economic issues, cultural issues, and constitutional issues. On the right-hand side of your screen, you should see a PowerPoint slide with a table. What you should do is look at the information on the left of your screen to fill in the table on the right, so that you can get a good idea of what major differences existed between the North and the South. Economically, the North was a highly manufacturing region. It was developing in its industry, and many factories were being built. Because of the businesses that were beginning in the northern states, northern leaders wanted the U.S. government to put tariffs on goods from Europe. A tariff is a tax on an import. This would help American businesses because it would make the prices of foreign products more expensive, so people would be more likely to buy products made by American businesses. The South, on the other hand, was mostly an agricultural region, which depended on slavery to work the fields, which would then produce the crops that could be sold. The Southerners opposed tariffs on goods from Europe because once tariffs were put in place by the U.S. government, Europeans would get upset and they would be less likely to buy agricultural products from the United States. So farmers in the South definitely did not like tariffs. Another main category of differences between the North and South were their cultures. Even though they were one nation, they were almost like two nations within a nation because their cultures were so different. In the South, like we've said, it was an agricultural region, very rural, and sometimes there were miles between plantations or small farms or small towns. On the other hand, in the North, because of the factory growth, cities were becoming more and more populated and more spread out among the states. People went to jobs working in factories and had a much different pace of life and way of life than people in the South did. Finally, there were some major constitutional issues between the North and South. In the North, most people favored a very strong central government, whereas in the South, people tended to favor the idea of states' rights, in which a state promoted its own interest over that of the entire nation. So if the national government passed a law that a state in the South didn't agree with, the idea of states' rights would be that that state could choose not to follow that national law, because it threatened the interests of their states. Northerners did not accept this for the most part. The idea of states' rights first came into question when President Andrew Jackson was in office back in the 1830s. The state of South Carolina did not like a tariff that the national government had created. Therefore, it chose to nullify, which basically means that that particular law would not go into effect for the state of South Carolina. President Jackson confronted this issue, and South Carolina ended up backing down. However, this was the first time the whole idea of the southern states asserting their rights and their desires first came into play. It would be a huge issue at the start of the Civil War. So the main differences that we've seen so far is in how the North and South made money, how they lived their lives, what they valued from the government, and these things came into direct conflict with each other to the point where there could be no reconciliation of these differences, and civil war broke out. Now let's turn our attention to the issue of slavery, which was involved in all of these differences between North and South. The issue of slavery was referred to as the peculiar institution of the United States. Many European countries and other countries around the world had outlawed slavery. The United States was still holding on to it, and mostly it was because slaves were moneymakers for the South. Southern plantation owners could earn huge profits off the backs of slaves, so obviously they weren't willing to give them up. As the U.S. expanded in its territory prior to the Civil War, the issue of slavery became more and more of a conflict between the North and South. The first time the issue was brought up was with the Missouri Compromise, which was made in 1820. Before 1820, there was the exact same number of slave-owning states and free states in our country, 11 free states and 11 slave states. However, This balance of power was upset with the entrance of Missouri, which had been a territory. You had to be a territory first before you could apply for statehood. When Missouri applied for statehood, this upset the balance of power between slave and free states in our country. The reason this was an issue was because in our system of government, we have, in the legislative branch, it's controlled by Congress, which is made up of two parts, a House of Representatives and a Senate. In the Senate, there are two representatives or senators from each state that go to the Senate and represent their state. In the House of Representatives, it's based on population. So the more people that live in a state, the more representatives they get to send to the House of Representatives. With there being 11 free states and 11 slave states, there were the exact same number of senators in the Senate. The reason why that's important is because neither side of the country, the North or South, could have any type of gain over the other in the Senate when it came down to voting on laws. So it was in the interest of both Northerners and Southerners to keep that balance and have there be an equal amount of slave and free states. So when Missouri applied for statehood, the question was it going to become a free state or a slave state? They applied to enter as a slave state, which made the northern free states upset. So there had to be a compromise that was worked out to solve this issue. Finally, to resolve this issue, there was a two-part compromise that was decided. It was decided that Missouri would enter as a slave state, but in order to preserve the equal balance, Maine, in the north, was admitted as a free state. Maine had previously been a part of the state of New Hampshire, but was now broken free into its own state. So now there were 12 free states and 12 slave states. Furthermore, a new boundary line was drawn between the North and the South, indicated by the red line. And it was hoped that in the future, anything that applied for statehood above the line would have to come in as a free state, and anything that applied for statehood below the line would have to enter in as a slave state. This compromise was in existence and worked relatively well from 1820 up until 1850, when a new issue arose over the status of California, which had just recently been gained from the Mexican-American War in the late 1840s. When the Mexican-American War was fought and ended, the United States gained a great deal of territory from Mexico in what's now the southwestern part of the United States. Areas that include Arizona, New Mexico, California, parts of Colorado, Nevada, Utah, now were a part of the United States. So now there was new concern because a lot of this area was below the line that had been drawn up in the Missouri Compromise. So it was assumed that most of these territories, when they applied for statehood, would become slave states. The Southerners obviously would like this because that means they could have expanded their agricultural way of life and continued to expand the use of slavery. Obviously, the states in the North were uncomfortable with this. An issue happened when California applied for statehood. Most of California lay below the boundary line from the Missouri Compromise. The Southerners wanted California to come in as a slave state. However, the people in the territory of California applied for statehood as a free state. So, there was a crisis at hand. The crisis was settled by the Compromise of 1850, which was proposed by a congressman named Henry Clay, who was known as the Great Compromiser. This compromise had four parts to it. Number one, California would enter as a free state, which would satisfy the North. Number two, the areas of the southwestern territory that had been gained from Mexico, namely the Arizona Territory and the New Mexico Territory, would be able to decide for themselves, according to the principle of popular sovereignty, whether to be a free state or a slave state when they applied for statehood. Another part of this compromise was a new fugitive slave law to make it the toughest ever. This fugitive slave law basically put a bounty out for escaped slaves that had run away to the North. Southerners could now more easily get these slaves back that had run away. However, many times free African Americans in the North were taken captive by slave hunters, who weren't even slaves themselves and brought back down the South in a term known as being sold down the river. Finally, the last part of the Compromise of 1850 made it illegal to auction or sell slaves in Washington, D.C., which was the national capital. Slavery in new territory once again became an issue in 1854 with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Similar to the Compromise of 1850 that allowed people of Arizona and New Mexico territories to have popular sovereignty, which they could vote on the status of slavery, the territories of Kansas and Nebraska, which were mostly above the line that the Missouri Compromise had created, were told that they could decide for themselves as well about the issue of slavery. The area of Kansas had a very bad reaction to this. There were many pro-slavery supporters that fled from Missouri to Kansas to vote illegally over their decision of whether or not to allow slavery. This battleground of what was happening in Kansas became known as Bleeding Kansas. Many people were upset by this Kansas-Nebraska Act because even though it looked good on paper by letting people vote in the territory of whether to have slavery or not, there was a lot of manipulation in the voting. Plus, it threw out the whole concept of the Missouri Compromise, which had worked for over 30 years. The disappointment about the Kansas-Nebraska Act and Bleeding Kansas was even shown in the U.S. Congress, where there was a beating between two congressmen. Senator Charles Sumner was beat almost to death by another congressman from the South because of supposedly Charles Sumner's verbal attack on the South. Clearly, the nation was being torn into two, with the battleground being between the North and the South. Main issues had to do with the right to own slaves, but not just that, to expand the way of life, either for the North or the South, and also which section of the country was going to dominate the national government. So in the end, who would win? The Southern states or the Northern states?